Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. I thought today I would return to a topic I've spoken about several times before. It's a very central and important idea that is the three characteristics of all conditioned phenomena. And of course, as you know, the three characteristics are dukkha, anicca, anatta, and they represent characteristics that are inherent in every conditioned object. So the only thing that's not included is nibbana. Everything else is marked by the three characteristics, or more literally, it's the three marks, the lakkhana. And as is usual with the Buddha's approach, the Buddha's way of teaching, the main purpose for expounding these three characteristics was not to make a metaphysical assertion about the nature of reality, but the purpose of the Buddha's teaching is always soteriological, that it is a way of viewing or holding the mind that tends towards a disengagement from samsaric becoming. If a person is viewing the world in the opposite terms, that is, in terms of the permanence, substantiality, and desirability or perfection of the objects, that's called the vipalasas, which means the hallucinations, perverse way of viewing the world, a wrong or incorrect way of viewing the world that leads in the end to our further ensnarement in samsara. There's a simile that the vipalasas are like a decoy set out by a hunter. The analogy given is that the hunters will find a clearing in the forest and build a deer out of sticks and twine and stick it in the middle of the clearing. And other deer will come along and say, here is a deer already here, not being bothered, this must be safe. And they come into the clearing and the hunters are hiding in the bush, and they shoot them with bows and arrows. And the deers come to their destruction by going after the decoy. And the simile is that the decoy is like the vipalasas, and the hunters are like Mara. That the decoy leads us to our destruction. The vipalasas lead us to the destruction of birth and death. It's a way of holding our perception of reality wrongly. Holding it rightly is viewing things through the lens of the three characteristics, because it's in accord with reality and because it tends or leads towards a disengagement from samsaric becoming. And these things, the lakkhana, they are intrinsic aspects of reality. They're not just a concept in our mind. The concept in our mind is either aligned with reality or not. And seeing the three characteristics is the way forward to liberation. This is the real practice of vipassana, This is clear seeing. It's another simile in the Visuddhimagga for the practice of vipassana and seeing the three characteristics. It says a man is fishing for eels, and he's up to his waist in swampy water, and he goes reaching in the water with his hand, and when he catches something squirmy in his hand, he pulls it out of the water, and the swamp is full of poisonous snakes. And he pulls something out, and if he sees it as three stripes, he throws it away before it has a chance to bite him. And eventually he catches the eel. And of course the snake with the three stripes are the objects of consciousness with the three characteristics. And the eel is the realization of Nibbana. So this model of, or this simile of practice is like you're doing the practice, you're draining the swamp of poisonous snakes, one by one. You see each object and see that it has these three characteristics. And it's important that it's not just at the level of the intellect, that you're not just conceptualizing and imposing onto reality a concept, but that you're actually seeing clearly the intrinsic reality in these three aspects. The first one is dukkha. It's usually given as the first. And of course, dukkha has a very central place in the Buddhist teachings. The Four Noble Truths are all formulated around the concept of dukkha. Dukkha is, broadly speaking, it's the imperfection or unsatisfying nature of the objects. The usual translation of suffering, as is many times stated, is not really fully adequate because the word suffering is too narrow. We know just from common experience that not everything we experience is suffering. We do experience pleasure and we experience a lot of neutral phenomena. But they all, even the pleasurable ones, are dukkha. Dukkha points to the inherently fragmentary, broken, shard-like nature of phenomena. When something comes into existence, when it's manifest, it's already, in a sense, a little broken piece of reality. And no conditioned phenomena can ever be fully perfected, can never be fully satisfying to the mind. This is how it works, the second noble truth, as the desire being the cause of suffering. Tanha is the cause of dukkha. At the most primordial level, it works by the mind wanting to take an object. There's the desire to take an object, and then the object does not satisfy the mind. It doesn't complete the mind. The mind is still left with this thirst for a completion, and it then moves on to the next object, and it keeps the samsaric wheel turning. Dukkha is easy to see when it's in the form of suffering, and that's called dukkha dukkhata, dukkha per se, or dukkha as suffering. But it's trickier to see it in pleasure and in neutral phenomena. Not seeing the dukkha in the pleasurable phenomena in particular is this hallucination, the vipallasa. We become caught and snared, and it inevitably fails. The project of seeking perfection in conditioned objects inevitably fails. It can't possibly win, it can't possibly reach that state of completion or perfection within conditioned phenomena. Another way of thinking about dukkha, or another possible translation, would be the provisional nature of phenomena. That everything which comes into existence is in a sense a work in progress. It's not complete, it's not perfect. It's just as it is. And it's important to understand and to see that this is an intrinsic quality of the objects themselves. It's not something we impose on the objects with the mind. The objects themselves are fragmentary. The second characteristic is anicca, impermanence. And that refers to the evanescent nature of all phenomena, that nothing abides, nothing persists. And this applies across all time scales. One way of contemplating dukkha is on the scale of lifetimes, to realize that I too shall die. This is maranasati, to realize that the human form or any form is impermanent. It can also be contemplated on very large time scales, and the Buddha makes this point in the Sutta of the Seven Sons, the Sattasurya Sutta, in the Anguttara Nikaya, where he takes what to the ancient Indian mind and worldview would have been the most permanent, stable thing in the universe, is Mount Sinnaru. And he says that even Mount Sinnaru will be reduced to ash and come to nothing. In our modern understanding and worldview, you can contemplate this in geological or cosmic scales. Those of you who drove out from Thunder Bay today, you drove past the Nor'Wester Hills. 20 million years ago, they were huge volcanoes. Every time you drive past them, they're going to be a little bit smaller as they're slowly weathering. Nothing in the earth or the sky or the sea is permanent. But the really most powerful and deepest way to contemplate anicca is on a momentary scale. That the nature of the individual phenomena, the dhammas that arise in the mind and in the body, are only in existence for a single instant. That there really is nothing that persists, even for an instant, moment by moment. Everything's in a state of constant flux. And the third characteristic is the most profound, and it really underlies the other two, and this is the characteristic of anatta, which is not self, or the expression of emptiness, of insubstantiality. This is the idea at the deepest level that the dhammas, phenomena that compose body and mind, are without substance. There is no essence. It's an expression of the more general teaching of sunya, of emptiness. And anatta is particularly taken at the personal or psychological level. There is no abiding, substantial, real self. The self only exists on a conventional or conceptual level. It's a kind of organizing principle. It's a way of organizing and making sense of our perceptions and our thoughts and feelings. But there's no actual self there. It's really a quite redundant concept. The idea of a self really has no explanatory value when you examine it. You can see the entire operation of the organism without reference to a self. I've used the metaphor of which is my updating of Melinda's Chariot. I've used the metaphor of the Green Goblin under the hood of an automobile. That somebody has just bought a new car. We'll call him Melinda. He's just went and bought a new car and he's really happy and proud of it. But he doesn't know the first thing about how cars work. So he talks to his friend Nagasena, who is a Class A mechanic. And he says, I just got this new car. It's really wonderful. And I was thinking about how it works, and I figure it must be a green goblin that lives under the hood that makes everything go. And the mechanic is, no, don't be stupid. There's no green goblin under the hood. It's the gasoline firing in the cylinders drives the pistons up and down. Okay, well, then the green goblin must make the spark. No, that comes from the distributor. Well, the green goblin must work the distributor. No, the energy from the distributor comes from the battery. And it could just go on and on and on endlessly. And you can explain in minute detail the operation of the car without ever reference to a green goblin. The green goblin only comes in as a fiction when you don't fully understand. So it's kind of a convenience, an artificial idea that explains things when you don't understand the detailed workings. So this is why the Buddha gave the teaching of the aggregates, the 5 aggregates. So you look at body, feelings, perceptions, consciousness, and mental formations. You don't find anywhere a self. Any one of them can be identified falsely as a self. And this is another teaching that the Buddha gave about the 20 kinds of self-view. You can take any one of the aggregates and create a false conception of the self around it in one of 4 ways. You can say, I am the body, or the body belongs to me, or I am in the body, or the body is in me. And you can do that with all the other aggregates. So 5 times 4 is 20. So a shorthand, a simplified way of remembering that or internalizing that is just to say, not me, not mine. And that's actually a good little practice to remember when you find yourself attached or caught in something, to whether it's internal or external, to say, not me, not mine. This too is not me, not mine. And exhaustively you go through all the snakes in the swamp. You don't find a me or mine anywhere. So these 3 characteristics, as I said, they're not to be thought of just as intellectual ideas, but they're intrinsic realities that we should be endeavoring to see things in that way. This is Yonaso Manasikara, right reflection. The reason we don't see things naturally in those terms is different for each characteristic. There's a kind of masking principle, an illusion that's appropriate or specific to each characteristic. For the characteristic of impermanence, there's the illusion of continuity. Because the conditioned universe is inherently lawful, it follows cause and effect. Things don't arise randomly in a scattered way, but they follow on each other by cause and effect. This means that succeeding moments will usually resemble each other. So you have something like that seems very permanent, like the mountains, and you think that there's a continuity there. The mountain's always a permanent, solid thing. But actually it's just succeeding moments, dhammas arising and falling away. And as the Buddha said, and as our modern geology says, if you could see things on a long enough time scale, you would see the mountains coming into being and passing out of being. Or as Dogen says, you can see the mountains walking. And this illusion of continuity creates a sense of permanence. And this also feeds into the illusion of a self, because there's this feeling, a sense of the continuity of a person, because of the orderly cause and effect. But if you think of the person who you were when you were 10 years old, it's quite different from the person who's sitting here now. But there's a linkage of cause and effect between the two. The characteristic of not self, or emptiness, is said to be masked by the illusion of compactness, meaning that we see a compound object and we tend to see it as a solid, as a thing. This is how we make sense of the world. We have all these impressions of sight and sound and smell coming from all directions, and our perception sees things in a way that's useful to us and functional. We see discrete objects. We see a person. We see a stove, a chair. Whereas on the ultimate level of reality, they're just dhammas coming in and out of existence. They see a compact unit. In terms of the individual person, we see ourselves and others as these compact units. One way to break up this sense of compactness is the meditation on the parts of the body, 32 parts of the body. So you see the body not as a simple compound object, but as something made up of innumerable, quite different parts and pieces in 3 dimensions. Another contemplation to break down the sense of compactness of the person and the body is what I like to call the idea of fuzzy boundaries. Where's the boundary of your person, your body? In each moment you're taking in air and expelling air, and in the course of days and weeks you're taking in solids and liquids and expelling them. You're recycling material through the body. The body's constantly renewing itself. It's like a ripple in a stream. If you've got like a little whirlpool going in a creek, the spiral pattern of the whirlpool might persist for some hours or even days, but the individual molecules that make it up are constantly new. They're refreshed from flow of the stream. So the body is really like a pattern in the flow of matter in the universe. It's like a temporarily persistent formation of pattern of the swirling of molecules. Also, something that's a little bit mind-blowing to contemplate, if you want to define the dimensions of your body, is to realize that the physical body generates an electromagnetic field. And electromagnetic fields propagate to infinity under the inverse square law, meaning they get increasingly attenuated from the source, but they theoretically never peter out completely. And they propagate at the speed of light. So if you're 50 years old, that would mean that your electromagnetic field reaches out 50 light years into space, cover several solar systems. And even after you're dead and gone, that field will continue to propagate outwards like a hollowed out donut. Mm-hmm. The characteristic of dukkha is masked by a different principle than the other two. The first two, anicca and anatta, the masking principle is something rather abstract and takes some explanation to grasp. But dukkha is very elementary and direct. Dukkha is masked by change of postures. And this has two levels of meaning. You take it quite literally as the dukkha in the body, the suffering in the body, is not seen or is masked by fidgeting. We shift our posture constantly, not to make an end of dukkha, but to shift it to a new constellation, because a change is as good as a rest. We don't notice it then for a few minutes. There's a story about a Burmese woman who was a lay teacher. One of her famous tricks was when someone came to see her, she'd have them sit in a comfy chair, and she'd say, get yourself comfortable, take your time, and she'd wait till they said, yes, I'm perfectly comfortable. This is a great chair. I'm completely at ease. And then she'd say, okay, now don't move a muscle. And then she'd start talking, and for most people wouldn't take 5 or 10 minutes. They'd be shifting and fidgeting. And she'd say, I thought you told me you were perfectly comfortable. Were you lying to me? She's making the point that your body is a constant mass of dukkha. Every dhamma in the body is imbued with dukkha, so there's no possible way you're not going to experience dukkha in the body. But we normally escape from it by fidgeting. That's why people often, when they start meditating for the first time, they experience a lot of pain in the body. And it's not really anything special. It's just that they're not used to sitting still. Don't have the usual course of fidgeting away from it. And on a less literal level, we also fidget away from dukkha in the mind. We shift the mind away from seeing the unpleasant reality, constantly jumping around with the mind. This is the monkey mind. It's also common experience in meditation. The mind doesn't stay still, constantly jumps from thing to thing until it can become quite confusing. And if we force the body and the mind to stay still, then we can see the inherent dukkha. And these three characteristics are the inherent marks of conditioned becoming. They're the inherent fabric of samsara. That the way out is down and through, and when we fully penetrate with the mind any one of the characteristics, it becomes a gateway of liberation, and it leads us out of samsara. So there are three directions from which one can enter into the deathless state. If liberation is by way of impermanence, this is called the animita liberation, or the signless liberation. Nimitta is a mind-created object, and as a technical term in meditation, a nimitta is, in samatha meditation, it's when the object becomes extremely stable. You hold an object, it becomes a nimitta. But when there's this penetrating samadhi without a nimitta, because there's no sense of permanence or abidingness, this becomes the signless liberation. If one goes through the gate of dukkha, it's called being a body witness. Because we looked at how the dukkha is experienced in the body. The body here can also mean the mental body. Kaya is also used. Sometimes it refers to the physical body, and sometimes it refers to the mental body, that is the citasakas, or the aggregates, the objective aggregates. When we see the inherent dukkha in these things, and we're being a witness to it, we're seeing them in their true nature. The body and the mind seen in its true nature is a realization of dukkha, and through that you go beyond dukkha. And if the liberation is by way of a penetration of emptiness, of not self, this is called the void liberation. The entry into emptiness, shunyata. And this characteristic of emptiness, in the broadest sense, underlies the other two. And it's also more universal, because whereas anicca and dukkha apply only to conditioned phenomena, sankharas, anatta applies also to the unconditioned, to nibbana. Nibbana is also sunya, empty. So anatta is the most universal of the characteristics. If you are practicing with these, from time to time, one or the other may become more evident. And this is fine, this is natural. All three are related, and they all have reflections into each other. In terms of practice, the way to see them is ultimately with vipassana, the clear seeing of each object that arises in the mind being seen without discrimination, without analysis, without picking and choosing, but just seeing each object in its own nature as it actually is. In terms of right reflection, yonaso manasikara, the way we think about and hold the totality of our perceptions and experiences. And if we see them through this lens of the three characteristics, then this is right reflection. As aids to this kind of reflection, there are two kind of directions that it can approach this goal, which we might call the analytic and the synthetic. The analytic approach is to see things on a finer and finer grain. Now, this begins with the understanding of the five aggregates, and seeing, breaking down the characteristics of the body, mind, organism, and seeing component parts and not seeing a self, and seeing the shifting impermanent nature, the imperfect nature in all these aggregates. And this carries on to a finer grain in the study of Abhidhamma, which is basically taking the five aggregates and looking at them even closer, breaking them down into more finer and finer categories, and not finding anywhere a substantial self. But in the end, everything just composed of empty dhammas, instantaneously existing, imperfect, insubstantial, empty dhammas. The other approach, which we may call the synthetic approach, instead of going to a finer and finer grain, is to look at the bigger picture and see the relational aspect of things. This is dependent origination, paticca samuppada, to see that nothing exists as an independent entity, but only as a result of a nexus of causes. Nothing exists without a cause, and nothing exists from a single cause. Nothing exists from its own side. This approach is probably most thoroughly elaborated and taken on by the Huayan school of Buddhism in China, which like to see everything as a complex interdependent matrix, so that no point is independent, and the whole universe exists in a single particle. And their most famous image is Indra's net. The god Indra, or Saka, is in his palace, this decoration or adornment of this three-dimensional weave of a net, and at each crossing point of the fibers there's a jewel, and each jewel has many, many facets. And if you examine any single facet, you'll see the whole rest of the net reflected, including all the jewels. And then if you could bore in finer grain, looking at the jewels in their reflection, you'd see that each of those has reflection of the entire net, so on infinitely. So the meaning of this is that no existent in the universe is really a substantial entity, whether it's internal or external. It's merely a momentary reflection of everything else. So just to sum up and conclude with the purpose of this teaching of the three characteristics is, as is all of the Buddhist teaching, is to liberate us from bondage to samsaric becoming, to see the way through and out. And this is done by fully understanding the nature of the condition. It allows us to disengage from it. The reason we're caught in the condition is because of the vipalasas, because of hallucination. That everything we experience in the conditioned realm, it keeps us hooked by the twin factors of the opposite poles of fear and fascination. We're either running away or running towards these various multicolored objects. it's like a kaleidoscope. This is this children's toy of a telescope-like thing that you turn the dial and you see all these pretty mandala-like images. And if you took a kaleidoscope apart, you'd see it's pretty simple. There's just a few mirrors and a few bits of broken colored glass that float around inside. And it's like samsara has all these endless, fascinating or terrifying phenomena. But if you could break it up and look inside, they're just endless combinations of these three bits of colored glass. Dukkha, anicca, anatta, in different combinations. And when you can take the mind to the place of clear seeing, you can see each Dhamma as just that. Well, this isn't so fascinating. This isn't so terrifying. This is just dukkha, anicca, anatta. And that can begin to undermine the process and allow the mind to break free.